At this point in my lecture, students often ask me the following question. Is it possible for a company to be both a low-cost leader and a differentiator simultaneously? Well, the way that the strategy field thinks about that particular question has changed significantly during the last few decades. The old way of thinking about that question would say that basically the answer is no, you can't do both. We can call this the stuck-in-the-middle viewpoint, and it's a viewpoint that is best exemplified by the argument made by Michael Porter in his 1980 book, Competitive Strategy. In that book, Porter argues that there is a fundamental incompatibility between a differentiator strategy and a low-cost leadership strategy, and that this fundamental incompatibility makes the choice of strategy an either-or trade-off. You can't do both. His logic goes as follows. In order to be a differentiator, a company must offer a product or service that delivers higher value to customers than the product or service that its competitors offer. And in order to deliver that higher value to customers, basically it costs extra money to do that. If it didn't cost any extra money to deliver that higher value to customers, then every competitor would do it, basically. And then it would no longer be a differentiator. The product or service would no longer be differentiated because all the companies in the industry would be delivering that higher level of value to the customers. So, Porter argues that it's basically impossible for a company to both differentiate in a way that delivers superior value to customers and also still be the low-cost leader. Therefore, in Porter's view, every company should make a committed choice to follow either a differentiation strategy or a low-cost leadership strategy, but should not try to pursue both simultaneously. Otherwise, Porter warns us that the company would risk being stuck in the middle, in a position that is neither differentiated enough to avoid a price war, nor cost-efficient enough to win a price war. And if a company is in this stuck-in-the-middle position, Porter warns us, because it's neither differentiated enough to avoid the price war, nor cost-efficient enough to win a price war, it's basically not in a position to earn a superior profit, because basically it has no competitive advantage. So, Porter's stuck-in-the-middle argument represents the old way of thinking about this topic. But in the years since Porter published his first book on competitive strategy, a more sophisticated view on this topic has evolved. Yes, we continue to recognize that companies can still fall into this stuck-in-the-middle trap if they lack clarity about their overall strategic goals, and if they instead try to be all things to all people. In that case, they may wind up pursuing an incoherent, inconsistent mixture of different initiatives, some aimed at cutting costs, others aimed at differentiation, but ultimately pulling the company in opposite directions and ultimately undermining each other. That trap is still possible. It can happen. But having said all that, and even recognizing stuck in the middle as a possibility, we nevertheless now recognize that there is another possibility. Porter's argument about the fundamental inconsistency of differentiation and low-cost leadership really only makes sense if you are assuming that every company competing in an industry shares the same basic set of activities and the same basic value chain. And that assumption, frankly, may or may not be true. Yes, if you share that same set of activities, that same value chain as all of your competitors, then yes, differentiating would mean that you have to be better at some or all of those activities. And that would require better resources, which would cost more, and would therefore prevent you from being a low-cost leader. No doubt. However, companies don't necessarily have to use exactly the same value chain and exactly the same set of activities as their competitors. It may be possible for a company to fulfill the same customer needs as its competitors fulfill, but to do so using a fundamentally different set of activities, a fundamentally different value chain than the activities and value chain that the rivals use. In that case, it may be possible for that company to be both better and cheaper simultaneously. That is, both differentiated and a low-cost leader. When that happens, we often call that a revolutionary business model because it uses a fundamentally different value chain and fundamentally different set of activities to create a superior value proposition and therefore beat this cost versus differentiation trade-off in ways that no other competitor can. Now, as this term revolutionary business model would seem to suggest, this is definitely a very rare phenomenon. I can name a few companies to point to as examples, but honestly, I can't name very many. So let me talk about a few examples. The 4 examples that I would like to discuss here are Southwest Airlines, Dell Computer, the Vanguard Group, and Walmart. Southwest Airlines has a radically different value chain than all other major airlines in the U.S. airline industry. And that's because all the other airlines in the U.S. airline industry use a hub and spoke route system, where basically they fly people from, dozens, if not hundreds of different airports to a central hub airport, then have them change airplanes and get on an airplane going out of the hub airport to their ultimate destination, right? So there's the other airlines use this 2-step value chain, a flight from the spoke airport into the hub airport, and then a flight from that hub airport back out to a different spoke airport, okay? The idea is that they want to be broad market players serving a large number of different cities and a large number of different routes. And let's say you're serving, just to use round numbers to make it simple, let's say you want to serve 200 different cities in the United States. So you want somebody to be able to fly from any one of those 200 cities to any other one of those 200 cities. Well, if you try to do that, if you try to accomplish that goal by having only direct, nonstop flights, then that would require roughly, 200 times 200 different flights. That would be like something on the order of 40,000 flights, something on the order of 40,000 different airplanes you would need. That's a lot of airplanes and a lot of flights, and it's a very inefficient way to do it because that would mean that there would be relatively few people on each of those flights, right? On each of those 40,000 different routes, there may be only a handful of people, 2, 3, 4, 5 people flying from Topeka, Kansas to Gainesville, Florida in a given day. And so what would you have to do there in order to serve all 40,000 of those markets point to point? Well, you'd have to put those passengers on some fairly small airplanes, and small airplanes are inefficient to fly. Well, so what do? These major airlines that seek to serve the broad market? Well, they use the hub and spoke system. And so instead of having 40,000 flights with 40,000 planes between each possible pair of these 200 cities, they simply have one plane flying between each of those 200 cities and a hub city. And so they have people come into that hub and change airplanes at that hub. And so, for example, Delta has its main hub in Atlanta and some subsidiary hubs in Salt Lake City and Cincinnati. And American Airlines has its main hub in Dallas. And United Airlines has its main hub in Chicago and a subsidiary hub in Denver. And so as a result, what these airlines do is they are able to serve a huge number of markets with a very small number of airplanes. And those airplanes are large airplanes, which are much more efficient to fly than small airplanes. And so what we're looking at here is what economists call the phenomenon of economies of scope. There are massive, massive economies of scope in the airline industry from the hub and spoke route system. You can serve something like 40,000 different routes with only 200 airplanes. In our little toy example here of an airline serving 200 cities. And that's huge economies of scope because you're using bigger airplanes, you're using fewer airplanes, you have less administration, you have less flights, you have a lot less labor, because certainly 200 pilots is a lot less than 40,000 pilots. And so it's just much, much more efficient to be a broad line airline using a hub and spoke route system than to do it being at a point-to-point route system. Okay, so that's the way the major airlines, Delta, American, and United, do it. Southwest Airlines removes one step from the value chain because they fly point-to-point only. They do not have a hub. They do not fly airplanes through a hub. And this gives them a number of benefits on both the cost side and the differentiation side. On the cost side, it makes Southwest cheaper. It makes their costs lower for two reasons. First of all, the airplanes don't sit around on the ground at a hub airport waiting for connecting passengers. As a result, those airplanes spend more of their time in the air and less time on the ground. And airplanes are only generating revenue for the airline when they're actually flying, not when they're sitting around on the ground. So the point-to-point route structure makes a more efficient use of the equipment than the hub and spoke route structure. The second reason why this different value chain helps Southwest Airlines is that each passenger takes only one flight to get from their origin to their destination. And flying a passenger twice is simply more expensive than flying that same passenger once. That seems, commonsensical. So those are the two reasons why it helps Southwest Airlines on the cost side. But it also helps Southwest Airlines on the differentiation side in a few ways. First of all, because they keep the airplanes in the air more of the time and have the airplanes spending less of the time on the ground, that means that Southwest Airlines can offer its passengers a wider variety of choices of what departure time they would like to take. And so that can be a closer match to the traveler's most preferred travel schedule. A second form of differentiation is that basically the service is simply quicker. The trip from the passenger's perspective is quicker because there's no stop in between. They go directly from their origin to their destination without having to make a stopover, without having to change planes. That is a form of differentiation. And the third form of differentiation is just in terms of service. Southwest Airlines has earned the airline industry's service Triple Crown for 5 years in a row. That Triple Crown consists of being the most on time, having the best baggage handling, and having the fewest complaints. And so, as a result of using a radically different value chain to beat the cost differentiation trade-off, Southwest has had spectacular performance. Despite having only 12% market share in the U.S. airline industry, Southwest Airlines' market capitalization in the stock market exceeds the total market capitalization of all other U.S. airlines combined. We repeat that. Southwest Airlines, with only 12% share of the U.S. airline market, has a stock market capitalization that exceeds the total of the stock market capitalization of all other U.S. airlines combined. And in the first 30 years since Southwest Airlines' IPO, shareholders in Southwest Airlines have earned a 150,000% return to shareholders, with that works out to an average of over that 30-year time period, an average of 48% return per annum. So Southwest is gaining both cost leadership through this hub bypass route structure and also differentiation through the hub bypass route structure. The problem is, you might ask, okay, well, if Southwest is able to get both of those advantages, why doesn't everybody do this? Well, you can't if you're trying to be a broadline competitor. The way that Southwest is able to achieve both of these competitive advantages simultaneously is by being a focused niche player. Southwest could not do this if they were going to serve the market from every U.S. city to every other U.S. city in the way that Delta, American, and United do. Southwest only serves smaller secondary cities that have uncongested airports. Of course, you need to have a very uncongested airport in order to pursue the sort of fast turnaround operations that Southwest has. If the airport that Southwest were flying into were very congested, it couldn't get the plane back into the air as quickly. And so that would be bad news for Southwest. That would make their strategy fail. But what Southwest does is they focus on the secondary airports. That is, airports in the smaller cities that are not as congested, and also in the bigger cities where there is a smaller secondary, underutilized and uncongested airport, such as Love Field in Dallas or Hobby Airport in Houston. In situations where where there's a big city where there is that sort of secondary airport, Southwest can serve those markets. Also, Southwest can only fly between those secondary cities or secondary airports where there is sufficient volume of business to justify putting a nonstop airplane between those two cities. So, because of those reasons, Southwest has to be a very narrow niche focused competitor. They cannot serve every city pair market in the United States. They have to be very selective. So they're able to achieve both cost leadership and differentiation, but the price that they pay for achieving both of those competitive advantages simultaneously is that they have to place limits on their growth. They cannot serve every possible market in the U.S. If they tried to, they would fail in terms of pursuing both of those forms of competitive advantage. So there's a lesson there. So getting back to the question, is it possible to be both cost leader and differentiator simultaneously? Southwest's example shows us, yes, it definitely is. But there's a price that you have to pay. Number one, you have to do things in a way that is radically different than the rest of your industry. And number two, you have to be limited in terms of the niche markets or sub-markets that you serve. You probably can't be both a cost leader and differentiator and also serve the entire broad market. You have to place limits on your growth in order to do that, as Southwest has. Okay, second example I want to mention here is Dell Computer. Now, Dell also has a radically different value chain than its competitors. It uses a build-to-order mass customization system for its production. And this build-to-order mass customization system allows Dell to sell customized PCs for basically around the same price or even cheaper when compared to what other companies charge for more generic, non-customized PCs. Also, this build-to-order mass customization system that Dell has is actually patented. Dell has, and you can check this out on their website, Dell has about a dozen patents on the system that prevent it from being imitated. And there's another big benefit to Dell on the cost side of having this build-to-order mass customization system, because Dell only builds to order, right? Because Dell only builds to order, its inventory costs are dramatically lower than its competitors. And that's so huge in a business where technology is advancing rapidly, like the computer industry. Because in an industry where technology is advancing rapidly, that means that inventory is becoming obsolete very quickly and is losing value very quickly. So the less inventory you hold, the better it is in a big way in a high-tech industry. So as a result, Dell's performance, like Southwest, has been spectacular. Over the first 10 years since Dell's initial public offering, its shareholders earned a 10,000% return on investment, which works out to be an average of about 58% return per annum. The third example I want to discuss is the Vanguard Group in the mutual fund industry. Now, in the mutual fund industry, the Vanguard Group takes the industry's standard value chain and basically turns it completely upside down. In a typical mutual fund group, there is an investment management company that manages the portfolios, all of them, of a whole set of mutual funds. And that investment management company is supposed to manage those funds' portfolios in a way to maximize the best interests of the fund's investors. But it doesn't always work out that way. In fact, it often doesn't work out that way. To a greater or lesser degree, these investment management companies have free rein to make decisions or to extract fees that advance their own interests and their own profits more than those of the fund investors. Now, by contrast, Vanguard reverses this value chain because Vanguard has the investment management company owned by the funds themselves and the fund shareholders through the fund. This unique institutional arrangement ensures that the best interests of the management company are always aligned with the best interests of the fund investors. And as a direct result of restructuring the value chain in this way, Vanguard is able to offer both industry-leading customer service and the lowest cost structure in the mutual fund industry. So over any given time period, Vanguard's mutual funds typically outperform the investment performance of 95% or more of competing mutual funds in the same investment categories. The fourth company I wanted to mention here as an example is Walmart. It's another great example of a company with a revolutionary business model. But I'm not going to say too much because we will be discussing Walmart extensively later in this course. I don't want to say too much about it now. But I just want to alert you to this. I want to alert you now that when we get to our discussion of Walmart, you should be thinking about how is it that Walmart's unique value chain allows it to beat the cost differentiation trade-off in a way, like these other three companies, like Southwest, Dell, and Vanguard. Finally, we do now have some rudimentary research to suggest that being both a cost leader and a differentiator is not only possible, but it's also highly beneficial. Using data from the Profit Impact of Marketing Strategy database, also known as PIMS, P-I-M-S, Miller and Dess report in their 1996 textbook that, on average, the return on investment of business units that have both a cost advantage and a differentiation advantage, that their return on investment is about 8 to 12 percentage points above the return on investment of business units with only one of these two forms of competitive advantage. And it's also a whopping 25 percentage points above business units with neither of these two forms of competitive advantage. So, in sum, the new view on competitive advantage is that yes, it is still possible for companies to get stuck in the middle. They should always be vigilant about avoiding that trap and that risk. But we now recognize that it is also possible, although extremely rare, for companies to use revolutionary business models to realign their value chain in ways that defeat the cost differentiation trade-off. Now, these are rare, exceptional companies that succeed at doing this. Companies like, Southwest, Dell, Vanguard, and Walmart, like I've discussed. They are rare, but those that succeed at doing this can reap enormous rewards.